I'm going to do a very short introduction. Today we have a very special guest, Daniel Ingram, who's visiting us here. And rather than giving a talk, we decided let's put him in conversation with our own David Germano, who's the executive director of Contemplative Sciences Center. Daniel Ingram's work is incredible if you're interested in Buddhism and Buddhism practice. He's really pushing the envelope of the discussions around practices called kasina practices, which are elemental practices, which we'll hear about, I'm sure, in our discussion today. And there's been much discussion historically about what it is to meditate or really contemplate and focus with deep intention on the elements, whether it be fire or wind or earth and so forth. And these practices, as again will emerge in the discussion today, made their way from early Indian discussions into Tibetan discussions around visionary experiences that emerged or were self-emergent through practicing and giving attention fully on these elements, which is the specialty of some of the practices that David Germano studies and has really spent his life studying, called the Dzokchen traditions, or the great perfection traditions coming out of late Indian Buddhism and into what we'll call Renaissance Buddhism in Tibet, emerging in the 11th, 12th centuries and developing onwards. So without further ado, I'd like to just welcome us into this conversation and this kind of dialogical space and see what might emerge from Daniel Ingram's lived experience of these kinds of emergent phenomena and from his experience, as well as David Germano's depth of knowledge and really thinking through these practices from the Tibetan perspective.
Okay, so are we using these for recording purposes or something? Is that right? Okay. Thanks, Michael, for that introduction. And I think I'm just going to start by briefly prefacing a couple of thoughts as to what led me to talking to Daniel and kind of to frame our conversation today. And this is also pretty informal, so feel free to ask questions at any point. We'll stop at some point for questions and answers more formally. But if you have questions or comments along the way, just raise your hand and you're happy to jump in and make the dialogue a trilogue or tetralogue or tetralogue or whatever it is. So there's two kind of things that I've spent a long time in my life kind of thinking about in terms of my study and involvement with Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And the first one has to do with the natural elements. So Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist thought from a very early time, like other Indian traditions, thought of the material universe in terms of, I always have to think about this in Tibetan so I can remember how to say it in English, earth, water, fire, wind, and space, and sometimes consciousness. Sometimes it was 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, but especially the 4 and 5. So earth, water, fire, wind, and then space as a fifth. And so this is how they thought about the material universe, kind of like we have our table of elements and so forth. This was how they thought about the constitution of material things, such as our bodies or chairs or tables and so forth. And so they spent a lot of time thinking about that, but they also spent a fair amount of energy creating practices around this. How do you contemplate the material elements, fire, wind, water, space, and so forth? How do you bring it into the meditative practice of Tibetan Buddhism and so forth? And so this is part of a larger phenomena also of thinking about meditative practices that take the natural world or take material things as their object of focus and so forth. And so that's the kind of first set of interest that just personally draws me to this conversation and so forth. Because as Michael mentioned, in the 11th century and 12th century in Tibet, you get an explosion of these types of practices in certain traditions, where they're essentially looking at listening to the elements, smelling the elements, tasting the elements, touching the elements, and so forth. So all 5 of the senses being engaged with the natural elements. So for example, with regards to water, you might go to a waterfall, to a place where there's this turbulent rush of water and so forth. And you just focus your mind on it. You focus all your senses. It's mostly talked about in terms of listening, but obviously there's a visual element to it, there's an olfactory element to it, and so forth. And there's less well-known practices that are explicitly about tasting, about smelling, about texture, and so forth. So, and the important thing to keep in mind is any of us can go to a waterfall and go, this is cool, you know, like a couple hours, or even to sit there and maybe read a book or something and think like, I'm doing elemental meditations. And that's perfectly fine. That's not really what they're talking about. Like they're talking about going off the deep end in terms of time and immersion and so forth. They're talking about spending hours and hours and days just immersing yourself in this. And that's a very different experience than a pleasant afternoon with a book and a picnic and so forth next to a waterfall. And so that's the kind of first set of things. Actually, I said two, but I'll say three. The second one is, over the course of the long history of Indian Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and other forms of Buddhist meditation across Asia, I've always been interested by the issue of the objects of meditation. And so often there's this theme in Buddhist meditation that the objects don't matter so much. What matters is your mind. And so you might use a different object, like a statue or a candle flame or your breath or a deity that you're visualizing or something. You can use different kinds of things, but what you're doing is you're working with your own mind. You're cultivating a capacity to focus or a capacity for open awareness and so forth. And the object is like interchangeable in some sense, disposable in some sense. It's just what happens to be at hand for you. And I've always had a different thought about that, which I think we can see in other Buddhist traditions as well, which is, what if we think of the object as mattering? That you as a subject, you as a mind, that you're entangled with the world around us. And if we choose to focus on a statue or a fire or our breath and so forth, it may just be a fundamentally different type of meditation with fundamentally different kinds of effects and impacts. And so thinking about that entangled nature of object and subject as meaning that the object matters, not just your personal mind or the awareness that you bring to a meditative practice, has always been a persistent interest of mine. And the third and final one, if I can remember, I know what it is. It's self-emergence is the word that I use, and Daniel will use it somewhat different language. But it's this idea that when you do a practice, things are going to emerge for you. And some practices, I mean, I think in the Indian and Tibetan and Southeast Asian Buddhist traditions, all of them focus on experiences. They all talk about experiences. They all pay attention to it. You know, it's not like, it's as if your organic chemistry teacher said, you know, I actually care about the experiences you have while you learn organic chemistry. I don't think they mostly do. They're mostly like, did you learn the damn, thing? I mean, or not? I'm really happy you had great experiences, but you actually failed the test, okay? So that's not what meditation is like. Meditation pays attention to the experiences. It uses them for a broad variety of reasons. It uses them as signposts. They tell you, are you on target? Have you derailed, etc. And they're also sometimes the goal of the practice. Sometimes they say the experiences don't matter, that they can just be distracting and you need to focus on the kind of long-term arc of the practice. But at some level or some way, they're always paying attention to experiences. And so in that sense, all of Buddhist meditation is interested in experiences. And experiences are all self-emergent. I mean, they emerge from yourself. They emerge from your experience. But I think, at least when I think about self-emergence, I'm thinking about a dichotomy between two different kinds of meditation. And this is a very artificial dichotomy. One type is practices that are more scripted in character. Like they really map out, you do this, you do that, and it's kind of very clear what experience they want you to have, and they're not that interested in leaving a big space for you to explore what comes up for you. They're more interested in you kind of marching through this complicated set of practices to have a certain set of experiences. And then there's other meditations where it's very clear that's not what's going on. They're trying to create spaces for you by virtue of the meditation where anything could happen. And that's what matters. What matters is what happens for you, what spontaneously emerges for you, and that becomes the subject of the meditation, rather than just following the script. And so to conclude this maybe overlong prelude, in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions that I study, 11th and 12th century onwards, when you do these deep, immersive meditations on the natural elements, like water or fire or wind or space and so forth, then what happens is you have some really strange experiences. I mean, because it's not like 2 hours in a picnic. It's like many hours and many days. And after a while, your head starts to spin. You start to have all sorts of experiences that happen: visual, auditory, emotional, physiological, and so forth. And so Tibetan Buddhists were, very interested in that, and they chart these out and so forth. And so I've always been very interested in these things, and that's what, before I ever talked to Daniel, I found one of his websites, firekasina.org. And kasina is a word from the Pali language of Indian Buddhism and Southeast Asian Buddhism, and Daniel can explain that in greater detail. And I was interested by this because it talked about what he was doing, but it also had a lot of diaries of his students and the kind of experiences they would have doing very simple things, like just staring at a candle flame for 6 weeks, not 6 weeks, 6 days.
The longest we've done is a month so far, our group anyway.
Yeah, a month there.
Yeah.
And seeing what happens when you just sit with a candle flame for a month. And this is hardly limited to Indian Buddhist or Southeast Asian Buddhist practices. You see these kind of traditions in many contemplative traditions around the world. So that was kind of the interest that I bring to this conversation. So maybe I'll start the dialogue then by asking you, Daniel, just to tell us a little bit about how you ended up becoming interested in this whole idea of elemental meditations, like what your pathway was to that place.
Sure, yeah, thank you. And thank you for that great introduction. And thank you all for being here, for your interest in these things. I'm really grateful to everybody who helped organize this. So yeah, this is really exciting for me. This is one of my favorite things in the entire universe. I think they've got me lavaliered, I hope
great.
so, yeah. So this is one of my favorite things ever to do. And weirdly enough, my idea of a vacation is a fire casino retreat. I could do whatever I want. And, the only 3-week block of time I've sort of mostly taken off in the last 2.5 years is I've been working on my charity and my research group that's going to help people better the mainstream medical clinical world to hopefully better relate to the deep end of practice, the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium. The only real break I've taken is to do a fire casino retreat. So, So how did I get into this? So I started having weird, energetic experiences when I was a kid. And then about 10 years later, I started going on intensive Buddhist meditation retreats, very traditional Vipassana, notice the breath, your mind wanders, bring it back to this present moment, 6 sense doors, 3 characteristics, pretty straightforward stuff. And I was going to places like Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and some Thai monasteries in India and stuff, and doing some Mahasi Sayadaw noting. And then I started hanging out with Bhante Gunaratana, who's a Sri Lankan guy who teaches a lot of shamatha and did his PhD in the jhanas, which are these deep states of progressively blissful and then peaceful and eventually formless states that are described in the old texts and that people can get into today. And he started talking about the 40 objects of meditation, and he was talking about kasinas. And I was like, kasinas? And I said, well, I've also seen that in these other books I was looking at. So you see them listed in the original Pali text, and they're probably pre-Buddhist. They were probably doing this long before the Buddhas. I don't think it originated with them. It's my guess anyway. I'm not a super deep scholar of these things. And then they talked about them some in the Pali Canon and a little more in the Abhidhamma, and then they really start talking about them a lot in the commentaries. And the commentaries in particular are the ones I was drawing from were the Vimudimagga, which is the path of freedom, and then which is, I think, around 1st century AD, and then, so it's like, 500-600 years after the Buddha. And then the next one is the Visuddhimagga, or the path of purification, which is about 400-ish years later, 5th century AD somewhere. Anyway, I'll probably got my dates slightly wrong. My brain's funny with numbers. But the basic idea is, I noticed they went on and on and on about the kasinas. And they made all these wild claims about them, and they were talking about them giving powers and flying and divine ear and divine eye and manifesting all these things. And the kasinas, it's basically you're using an external object as a support for concentration. So you might look at a fire, you might look at a prepared colored disc, you might look at some earth that you've purified and made into sort of a thing you would stare at, or just stare out at the sky, or you might make a screen or something and have a hole in it and look at the space that's in the screen and just look at it. And so anyway, and there's all these instructions, and so that was interesting. I was like, why do they go on and on and on when writing was so expensive and very few people could do it, and it took a lot of time, and they just did pages and pages and pages. And I'm like, wow, why does nobody talk about this these days, or at least nobody I was hanging out with? So anyway, so I was like, well, that is really interesting to me. And then I ran into a guy I'll call Honey Bunny. And Honey Bunny was a thelemic Western magical practitioner in the tradition of Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn and that kind of stuff, who also, they talk a lot about elemental stuff, because elemental stuff came to them not only through, Crowley was influenced by the Theosophical Society and Blavatsky, who took all this Asian stuff and this Western stuff and this Kabbalistic stuff and this alchemist stuff, and they tried to put it all together into one great thing. And they sort of interestingly did in some kind of very colorful, moderately confused, somewhat idealistic, but in other ways absolutely amazing kind of way. And so the Western contemporary magical traditions were also talked a lot about elemental practice, and he said he had done a lot of elemental practice. And they talked about, he said he could do strange things, like draw a star with a circle around it in the air, a pentagram, and he said he could see it when he drew it with his finger. And I tried, and I couldn't see anything, and I was like, well, that's pretty weird. So anyway, so these are forces and factors converging, and then I find myself on a meditation retreat in the second year of medical school, where I'm training that all this stuff is crazy and needs meds, right? So that's what, that's what I'm getting during my day school. And then I go on this retreat, 17 days at Bhavana Society in 1999, and I was working on, sort of, in the Vipassana tradition, they had this thing known as insight stages. And I had gone through the insight stages I wanted to go through and felt satisfied with that. And I still had a week left of this retreat. And it was a retreat for advanced practitioners where there was no instruction or anything. There was nothing you had to do. It was just a space. We all came, we practiced together in the cold of West Virginia, and not too terribly far from here, and in the snow. And we went as deep as we could, doing whatever we wanted to do. And so after my insight stuff, I said, well, let's play with some fire kasina, because I've got a little lamp, and it's one of the kasinas, and the white light and fire kasinas in the tradition I was thinking of are all kind of considered like top shelf kasinas. These are the good ones that kind of lead to the most stuff. And if you kind of get them, they think, okay, that's the good stuff. So I had this little oil lamp, and I started looking at it. And I would look at it for a while, and then I would close my eyes and see if I could get the nimitta, or the learning sign, and then the nimitta. And exactly how nimitta is defined literally could be a whole lecture. So I'm going to kind of gloss that one unless people really want to go into it, because that's a long conversation. But anyway, so I started, yeah, thank you. Yay, this is good. I appreciate your written support for their edification. So started getting, I would close my eyes and I would see a red dot, and then I would see a sort of a gold spinning thing, and then it would become a black dot, which seemed wrong to me. That seemed the wrong direction. And then everything would become sort of very gray and hazy, and I was like, well, this can't be right. And then as I went through that sequence, and then I would open my eyes and I would go back and I would look at the candle flame for another minute or so, close my eyes and run the sequence again. And then this mantra came to me. So before I knew it, I had a mantra in there. It happened to be a Hindu mantra. I have no idea why. Not a particularly Hindu-influenced person necessarily, a little bit, but not a lot. And so anyway, so I've got this thing and these images. And before I knew it, then it was like red dot and gold spinning thing and black dot, and then a bunch of flux lines around it, these fine kind of rainbowy lines making elaborate patterns. And then they start getting wider and wider. And then they start sort of curving around and becoming like many-fold radial symmetry. And then, this is the sequence. And this is unfolding over a number of days. And I'm just running the sequence. I'm like, I'm just going to do this until something cool happens. I've got a week. We're just going to do this the whole week. So eventually, within a few days, and again, I'm pretty powered up at this point. And I should mention by this point, I think of myself, regardless of whatever controversial things people say about me on the web, it's a controversial subject world these days, I thought of myself as having some reasonably strong meditation chops by this point. So I'm using all my meditation skills together to try to see these things and really connect with these internal experiences that this thing is generating, okay? So, and then I get to the point out past in the sequence where it's like red dot, gold thing, black dots, things, this radial symmetry, wider and wider, and then all of a sudden start shifting into wholly different spaces where I'm now somewhere else. And I would be in a space, and there was the white Vajrasattva and consort that I never could, generate, much less complete, when I got that empowerment. And it's like Pixar couldn't do it this good. And it's living, and it's like conscious, and it's three-dimensional, and I'm in this space where this thing is, and I'm like, oh my God, or oh my Buddha. Anyway, sorry, wrong religion. Anyway, and I'm looking at this thing going, you've got to be kidding me, right? Because I'd read these old Tibetan texts, and I was like, these elaborate visualizations, and you get it luminous and transparent and three-dimensional and living with all these details. And I was like, how the hell are people doing that? Really? Because I had tried visualizing and I sucked at it. Right? I was no good. But all of a sudden, through the power of this thing, I'm finding myself in these spaces where now I can just pre-program this, and when I go through the sequence and out past the sort of symmetrical flux line thing, and then the space shows up, there will be whatever I want it to be. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And I've been a huge fan of kasinas ever since. We can talk more about that, but that's like the quick intro. So that's how I got super into kasinas, and then there's a lot else we could chat about. But Matt, now maybe you have a question, and you probably have a bunch of thoughts. So I'm going to stop there.
Should I use the microphone or?
I think that use that microphone.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you did you have your eyes open? Was it like your Aleister Crowley friend and the?
Yeah, we're getting that. Okay, yeah. So, and the other thing I noticed is at this point, I now draw I can do a lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, and I see the friggin' pentagrams. And it started off subtly, right? So initially it starts off like a clear smear in space if you're trying to draw a symbol. And even now, because I've done enough of this, well, I like this one. Yeah, if I really slow down, I can see maybe a 2-inch sort of smear in space because I've done a lot of this. But it's nothing like what I can do on retreat, which brings in another concept which I call powered up. So what I can do on retreat when I'm powered up and have paid my entrance price is vastly beyond what I can do straight out of the gate sitting here for you today. And it also fades pretty fast off retreat, the fancy stuff. Within a day or two, a lot of it is gone. But when you're up there and you've paid your entrance price, for me it's about 100 hours over a week or 10 days or something, then there's the ability where suddenly whatever color, particularly if I've been working with a particular color, like if I've been working with red or purple or amber or white or whatever it is, whatever color I've been working with, I can draw it and it'll get longer and longer and longer and brighter and brighter and brighter in terms of what I see coming off my finger. And if I do this well enough, eventually it ends up like Doctor Strange, where it's that good. And it looks to me like this, if you've seen the amber discs they're playing with in the movies, that's within the realm of possibility if you get your concentration powerful and really focus on a color or a quality or a something. Then, as it says in the text, and if you do this well enough, like if you're, as it says in the books, the person who's doing the red kasina sees red everywhere. And you'll start to see flashes of the color. You'll start to see things start to turn the color you're working with or the quality you're working with. And then eventually it looks like you're wearing rose-colored glasses and there's this sort of red overlay or whatever color you're working with on everything. And then as soon as you cut the power, that all starts fading, right? If you go off retreat or drop the dose. But while you're up there, then all of a sudden all that is possible. And so and then I started getting all kinds of other effects I would never have imagined, don't know how to map, wouldn't ever have known to ask for, that I'm unbelievably grateful for. So I want to express my incredible gratitude to the countless people who figured this stuff out, because I could follow instructions, but I wouldn't have figured it out de novo. Right? I'm not that good, but I could follow instructions. And thanks to all the people who transmitted it and brought it forward to us today, because that was a staggering amount of work and cost. So anyway, you probably have all kinds of thoughts on this. I've been talking for a while.
Yeah,
what do you got?
So let me just also keep everybody on the same page.
Thank you.
So Daniel mentioned a few words here.
Yeah.
Shamatha and Vipassana are both Sanskrit words, and they refer to an early way that Buddhists classified meditative techniques. Like they basically said there's two dominant kinds of things going on. One is these practices that literally means calming, and these are practices for developing deep states of concentration. And then Vipassana, literally something like insight or superior vision, are more like intense observational practices where you're watching the impermanence of phenomena or the nature of your emotions as they rise and fall and so forth. So like intense observation. And then this word jhana, which in Sanskrit is dhyana, is these deep states of concentration that you progressively go through, which Buddhists kind of theorized. And kasina is those practices with the natural elements. And finally, nimitta is this word that literally just means sign, but it becomes a flashpoint for Buddhists talking about these visual, especially visual experiences that you have and what they mean and when they come and so forth.
Yeah.
So I'm going
Thank you.
ask you just a very particular question about this, just to jump into the whole world of self-emergent experiences. And there's a very dominant tradition in Buddhist thought and practice, which almost everyone shares at some level, which is to say these experiences don't matter. Because like you can have all sorts of crazy experiences. You can see this and that and so forth and etc. And it literally means almost nothing as measured by things like, are you compassionate? Are you wise? Are you efficacious in this world? Are you resilient? Like all these kinds of things that Buddhist thought and practice are oriented around producing as outcomes for individuals. I mean, that's a really dominant motif in Tibetan, in Buddhism. And
Right.
I think we've all known people at the drop of a hat or just seen all sorts of things.
Right.
Like literally a drop of a hat. I remember once I had a Tibetan woman that I was involved with, and she would just be like, I remember I took her sometime to this this Chinese contemplative thing, and as the lights got lowered, she started seeing stuff. And I was like, hey, we haven't even started yet. Okay, you got to calm down. So, and then on the other hand, there are these practices where there are these like maps and these models of like, you're going to see this, it maps off to meaning that you've progressed this far in the practice, and they actually become important milestones, they become important subjects of the meditation and so forth. So I wonder if you could talk to us about how in your own experience and experience with people that you've taught these practices to, how do you differentiate between those two? Where you're seeing a bunch of stuff, but is it really having an impact upon who you are and your capacities in this world as measured by what your values are?
Yeah, those are great questions. And it's not that I can't totally appreciate the point of view of people who say, really where the rubber meets the road, the compassion, the kindness, the ability to show up, to be present, to be skillful is the whole point. And they're making an excellent point. And that's a perfectly reasonable point of view. And you find that particularly in Zen. So Zen is like the strongest one of them, where this is all illusion, it's all moksha, it's all whatever. They just no. Just the wisdom, the emptiness, the practice enlightenment, the koan, the whatever, and basically ignore all that stuff. It doesn't matter. So that's a lot of Zen traditions kind of lean heavily that way. Though weirdly enough, in the back rooms and stuff, you'll start hearing about energetic practices, and you'll start hearing about chakras, and you'll start hearing about this other stuff. But on their public front, definitely like not cool, right? So you get that Taoist influence and just practice, which can make this stuff show up in the back rooms, but yeah, not the public way of advertising. And then you have the far other extreme, where like a lot of the Pali texts talked endlessly about powers. They talked about effects. They talked about entities. They talked about the specifics. They talked about past lives and experiences and all kinds of stuff like that. And these seem to super care about that. Like it's nearly impossible to read the Pali Canon and think they had anything like that point of view, though occasionally you would hear the Buddha say things like, oh yeah, the powers, they're just a distraction and abhorrent. And then other times he would praise people who had mastered various powers. And so even within Buddhism, you find these two poles. And I can respect the heck out of both poles and everything in between. And I think there's points of view, and I think at points we may need these. Like it is way easy to get way into the powers and run into all the problems that this side, which is anti-powers, it's all whatever, talks about. And they're right. These people are right, sure. And then this side is also right. And let me talk a little bit about how this side is also right, that the powers can be, yeah, not only dangerous and distracting, which they totally can be, and we can talk about that, because these things, as I say, when anybody comes on a fire casino retreat with me, the first thing I will say is, this is not safe. And I mean that. I'm not kidding. And we can talk about the ways we think we know that. But on the other hand, they can be unbelievably healing, transformative. And the weird thing about this sort of sense of division of shamatha and vipassana, or samatha and vipassana, as we'd say it in Pali, is that they're actually not clean divisions. And so I know people who did these elemental kasina practices, and all they got was insight. They got no powers, they almost got no jhanas, but they got what we think of as paths, which are these attainments of levels of awakening, and so, and then some people get powers and jhanas and energetics and archetypal stuff and all that. So anyway, I'm going to talk about this one experience, and this is pretty dramatic. So again, a lot of fire casino is just looking at what we call pixel rain, or the static, of the back of your eyelids, and it's kind of, uncongealed garbage. So please, that's what many of the hours of this is. But I'm going to talk about one of my absolute best, like this, thank you, fire casino, oh my gosh, experiences, so please don't get into comparison or problems with this, right? Because it can get a little weird when we start talking about this stuff, just to normalize that. So I was an ER doctor for 12 years in my practice and 3 years of residency, and the last 2 years of medical school were clinical, so however many years that is, I think about 17 years of clinical practice, seeing terrible things. I worked in level 1 trauma centers, pediatric level 1 trauma centers. I saw some horrendous stuff. Terrible, like as bad as you could get, blood and guts and gore and people dying and screaming and traumatic things, like war zone kind of stuff. And I thought I was handling that pretty well. Okay? So I graduate on March 29th, 2000, sorry, not graduate, God. I retire March 29th, 2018 from my medical career. And on the next morning, I have a flight to Paris. And we're going to go from there to Normandy, to a place called the Chateau de Buffalo. It's a beautiful place with a lot of water around, a lot of space, a lot of forest and trees and earth. Very important to do a fire kasina retreat. Okay? That night, all of a sudden, my brain and body are like, you're going to deal with all the traumatic stuff you saw. And I start having unbelievable nightmares. Like, the room is filling with blood, and there's 14 people with their guts hanging out, and they're screaming in agony, and I can't find any supplies, and they're all dying, and we're all going to drown, and they're all blood, and like that kind of horrible, full-on, vivid, terrifying. I'm waking up, drenched in sweat 6 times a night, 7 times a night, 8 times a night from these dreams, and this continues. Going to Paris, going to Normandy, each night, same thing. I've never had anything like this. I'm a vivid dreamer, but this is really horrible stuff. This is clearly PTSD from an accumulation of terrible things, right? Because I saw a lot of bad stuff. So, and this is going on the retreat as well. We start the retreat. I'm very powered up by day 7. But every night I'm still having like nightmares. And the nightmares are getting weirder and more vivid. And as I get farther and farther into the retreat, they get stranger. So I'm not going to keep going on about those. But the point is, the real transformation rubber hits the road here where, and I want to preface this by, I don't know how to do this, and I don't know how to tell anybody else to do it. And I wish I did, but I don't. So it's day 7, and I show up for breakfast, and they said, hey, breakfast is going to be about 10 minutes late. And I say, okay, I'll go sit. So I just sit down, and I sit down in this thick and ridiculous bliss. And all of a sudden, I'm in a totally different space. I'm not in the meditation room at all. And this is within a few seconds of hitting the cushion. I can see my aura, and it looks like an electric blue bar magnet, electric fields coming out of me. And there's this white, sparkly space I'm sitting in. And there's this bliss. And I sit there for 5 minutes going, really? I'm a good meditator, but this is like, wow. And then all of a sudden, one of these memories comes up. And I think it was one of the dead kids. And the kids tended to hit me way harder than the adults. It's just a thing. Anyway, but it shows up like a little phone icon. Somewhere around my dantian is a space down here if you're an energetic Taoist kind of person. And it flips over a few times and it disappears. And when it disappears, I feel this unbelievable weight lift off my shoulder. Just incredible. Like I'm freed from something. It's like, wow. That was good. I wonder if I could do that again. So I call up another one. So I call up another memory, and sure enough, it shows up like a phone icon, flips over, and disappears. I know that sounds totally nuts. Sorry. Anyway, and then I start bringing them up in batches. And I start bringing them up, 5, 10 at a time. And within a few minutes, that's all the terrible medical stuff I can remember. I missed a few, it turns out, but I got most of them. And then I start going through divorce and traumas and surgeries and childhood playground stuff and early childhood things and every single thing I can remember, and they're doing the same weird thing, right? And this is something you can't find in a book, so I don't know what the hell this is. I can't map it. I can just describe it. This is pure phenomenology at this point. And after about 5 minutes of this, I'm like, that's all the bad stuff. And I have this sense of lightness that is unbelievable. And all of a sudden the bell rings for breakfast, and I open my eyes, and suddenly I'm back in the room, meditation hall, and I stand up. And if any of y'all have swum a mile or two, and you get out of the pool and your body's all shaky and kind of rubbery, anybody ever done this? Anyway, my whole body felt like that. And my face and my throat, it felt like I had been crying for hours. It had that taste, that feel, that, I don't know, there's a quality to it. But I hadn't been. And all the nightmares stopped. And now I can talk about this stuff and not feel like I'm going to cry, even though it was still really sad. And it healed the heck out of me. And I wouldn't have known to ask for that. It's not on any maps. I don't know how to tell anybody to do it, except, I don't know, try fire kasina retreats and maybe. And that was a major, major healing and turning point in my life. So I'll just tell that story and let it be there for you all to think about. Anyway, thank you, Fire Kasina. One of many I could tell, but one of the better ones.
So here's a question. You mentioned about how does one take those kind of experiences and transmit them to another person. So one of the great arguments in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism about meditation is the degree to which meditative practices are themselves self-sufficient in terms of being transformative forces to produce the kind of person that you aspire to be, and to what degree they need to be linked to other kinds of factors, such as ethics, such as behavioral practices, such as philosophical understanding, such as cosmologies and so forth. And that tension is a source of a lot of debate over time, these 3,000 years. And so and I think the question would be so at least from a typical Buddhist perspective, so you go into this practice and there's something that you aspire out of this practice that, of course, people can go into the practice and say, I want to find the yak. I mean, literally, I remember one of the great stories of Tibetan Buddhist saints, the life of Shapkar, where he does this really complicated practice, and the goal is to find a yak. Because some dude has lost his yak. Yaks are pretty important in a nomadic culture like Tibet. And so he does this really high-end thing, which is supposed to make you a Buddha, but it's to find the yak. So people do meditations for all sorts of purposes, but in the bigger Buddhist scheme of things, it's to try to produce the kind of person that you want to be, whatever that looks like to you, or to the tradition that you're involved with. So in terms of thinking of the power of the practice to produce that outcome, not simply some capacity to do something in the world, so whether it's find a yak or some of these powers that the texts talk about and so forth, but to be that kind of person that you're aspiring to become. And not just those were some really cool experiences and so forth. Then I wonder, when you're working with people who you're teaching these practices to, how do you work with them around those kinds of issues? The kind of issues being, here's the practice per se, and then here's the kind of person that maybe is the reason that you're involved with teaching these things to people and why they're drawn to the practices, maybe not. But in a Buddhist context, that would certainly be the case. What are the other, or what are the ways either extrinsic to the practice that you're combining with that, or what are the ways that you're guiding them through the practice that helps produce that type of outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let's just say what I'm about to say is as much art and speculation as it is science. To be perfectly frank, the epidemiologist in me that looks at the evidence quality for all of this is yeah, but anyway, so just we have these parts. But then there's the other side of me. So what do we do to try to produce these outcomes? Well, first, all three trainings, morality, concentration, wisdom, the ethical component, the understandings, psychology. Also very careful selection of who I do this with, right? I this is not safe stuff. Again, this is deep end stuff. It can do super weird things, even in theoretically super sane, balanced together people. As you're rewriting the code this dramatically while the operating system is running, it can go very, very strangely in the short to medium term and occasionally the very long term. So particularly at this high-end level of intensity. So we try to choose good people for this. We try to make sure that they can handle themselves, that the kind of people that not only can handle themselves, but even while they might be going through challenges, might have reserve capacity to handle others. So I tend to look for people who have a well-developed set of skills, ethics, a background that demonstrates that they are a proper person to do something this, it's like, who would you want to climb Mount Everest with? People who had, really good lung capacity and strong muscles and endurance, but also a lot of psychological balance, right? That's the kind of question. Not that this is necessarily that, all of you could do this and probably get some interesting out of how many bad things would happen. We got about 20-ish something people here. About 3 is my current guess. About 3 bad things would happen if all of you did this. Anyway, so that's my rough guess is about 1 in 10 goes sideways. And that's a pretty high number for this end of practice as well. So what do you try to do? You ground people in both, from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, like emptiness and compassion. So compassion is trying to reduce your own suffering and the suffering of others, right? Thinking about which direction you tune your mind. So the other important thing is you're building something that's like an acetylene torch. A concentrated mind is like a cutting torch. And a cutting torch can either cut through delusion or it can just cut your friggin' arm off. And so you have to have a tremendous amount of both appreciation of compassion of how you tune this to things that reduce suffering rather than increase suffering. What sort of tracks your mind starts to go down and how you guide it towards good tracks. Now, this is something of a debate because you have the people that are like, it's, being eaten by the demon or whatever and putting yourself in its mouth if some old Tibetan story, that is like, what was the healing thing? And then you have other people who are like, no, demons is a bridge too far. Anyway, so that's even these kinds of topics, you have to see how people are handling entities and energetics and all that. But you're also going in with the appreciation of emptiness, of immediacy, of luminosity, of transience, of spaciousness, of ephemerality, of causality, of naturalness. And a lot of other frameworks talk about psychological coping skills, we talk about defense mechanisms, we talk about archetypes. Some reasonable understanding of archetypes is super useful, which in Tibetan they tend to do through various deities and or demonic personifications of various things. Anyway, you know way more about this than me. I'm just kind of so those are some of the things we do to try to have good outcomes when we do this. Bye. Anyway, so. You want to start talking about this? Because you may have some other ideas on this that are similar. You've done a bunch of these things.
Well,
what are your thoughts?
Actually, I wanted to ask some questions about the actual practices. So
okay.
Why fire as opposed to water, as opposed to... I mean, I can answer myself that question, but I wonder how you answer that question. Why did you end up focusing on fire as opposed to water or space or earth or wind?
Yeah, well, actually, later I ended up focusing on all of those things. So we should talk about elemental balance. So just focusing on one element can make you elementally imbalanced. And this is going to start to sound woo-woo to some of you. That is totally a true effect. Pragmatically, regardless of whatever underlying philosophy you have, when you start doing fire kasina, you start getting hot. It is a thing. So one of the first group retreats I ever did of this was at a medieval defensive tower in Scotland in February. It's got huge stone cold walls and a few paltry little electric heaters and one teeny little wood stove to try to heat this massive cold sink, that is like, and it's damp and it's dark and it's dreary and it's snowing and there's rains and whatever. And I showed up and I was so cold the first few days. By day 8, I'm walking around in bare feet in a t-shirt and my sweatpants are too much and I wish I had shorts. And then by day 9, I'm going down to the creek and which is probably a degree above freezing, and grabbing stones and holding stones like a big stone in the creek with my hands and feet in the water trying to cool down, right? Because these are early days of experimenting with this stuff. I don't know about early elemental balance. I don't have nice teachers who can tell me these things. We're just kind of winging it. It would be great if I had masters and the kind of people you likely trained with to help me out, but we didn't have those things. So I started to realize, wait a second, if I hold a stone in a freezing creek, then I don't feel like I'm going to burn up. And so then we began realizing that elemental balance and paying attention, to different kinds of things, such as air and the expansiveness of air and space is super useful, and wind, as well as water, particularly if you can get moving water, I think moving water is cool. Anyway, and then earth and grounding is actually super helpful, and each of those have their own qualities very distinctly and do different things, weirdly enough, but it's just true, as David keeps pointing out. And so we've actually realized that the setting you actually choose should have all of these in some good way. It's nice if it has a good view. It's nice if it has water right there. And it's very nice if it has good forests or good rocks or something. Luckily, everywhere you have has ground, so that's not a hard one to find. But actually, these are super important things. I'm just going to, you want to riff on that at all?
Well, I'll ask you a particular question, which is, In the Tibetan tradition, the one that's most unclear is actually earth. Because when you think about it, and I say, hey, go listen to the sounds of wind. Well, I mean, how hard is that? Go to a windy place. Go listen to the sounds of water. Go to a waterfall. Go listen to the sounds of fire. Go sit in front of a fire. And I say, go listen to the sounds of earth. What are you going to do? Well, it's actually not so clear in the text what you're going to do, whereas the others are really clear.
Yeah.
And I could tell you what some of the texts talk about, but
It'd be interesting, actually.
But well, some of them talk about like making a ball of clay and then slapping the clay back and forth between your hands,
Oh, I
and then
like
listening to the sound. But of interest is recently, right next door, we're currently building a building here at UVA called the Contemplative Commons, and it's right next door here, that construction site. And one of the rooms in the building is actually dedicated to water.
Nice.
And what it is it basically, the Del Pond over there, we're putting a variety of sensors into the Del Pond, and then we're making like three-dimensional images of the interior of the pond, like seaweed and fish and so forth. And then the room has laser-etched glass blocks for walls that replicate those three-dimensional images in the laser-etched glass blocks. And then the data from the pond gets fed into the room and gets converted into a series of musical compositions and lightscapes in conjunction with the changing nature of what's happening in the pond, the movement of fish, the water level, etc. Now, that same is an artist from the UK named Wolfgang Buttress. That same artist suggested another one, which I've not raised the money for. It's a meditation upon earth. And what he proposed doing was putting sensors into the trees back there, and then the sensors would monitor the movement of sugar and water and so forth within the trees, and then that would be fed back in real time into these two towers that we have in the building that open up to the sky, and you would basically put your head against the wall of that tower, and a series of vibrations and sounds would come out based upon what was happening in that tree at that very moment.
Nice.
So that was his idea of meditating upon earth.
I like it.
Hardly obvious, right? I mean, so I'm just curious about how one meditates upon earth.
Well, I'm actually going to shift slightly and talk about the internal intermediates. Because one of the things you start to notice if you do, so it is both true that the kasinas are unique, and also true that if you do one kasina well enough, you may get all of the kasinas. So, so both are true in that weird kind of annoying way. So through doing fire kasina, actually all of a sudden I was doing fire kasina one day, and all of a sudden I started seeing all these bubbles, like clear bluish aqua bubbles, and I started seeing, flowing streams. And before I knew it, it seemed like I was like, if my head was kind of in like a stream that was flowing around some turbulent rocks, and that was what I was seeing and feeling and hearing, like suddenly as if I was in water. And even though I had started with a fire practice, watery things showed up. And my first experience of what I'll call realms, other than that happened on that first retreat, but like in terms of a fully formed thing where you see them in a space that actually seems like someplace things could actually live, was actually all of a sudden I found myself underwater with I could see the waves probably 40, 50 feet above me and the light streaming through, but I was in the water and I could feel the gentle sort of like there was clearly some sort of slight wavy kind of something. I could see bubbles in the way, and it was like three-dimensionally immersive experience. And it was on a fire casino retreat. So that's the first thing. But the second thing in terms of answering your earth question, I'm going to briefly talk about intermediaries. So initially, so you start with the solid external thing, the water, the earth, the air, or the fire. And then you close your eyes and you get a whole bunch of colors and stuff. And then you sort of get static, and that's what we call the murk. There's this weird phase where like, what am I seeing? It's kind of garbage. And then if you can get out past that, which for me is 3 to 5 days of work generally, so don't be thrown by this and think, oh, this doesn't work. You've got to get out past the murk phase, which is like a challenge phase or anyway. But once you get out past that, things will start to coalesce. And you start to see lines and patterns and shapes. And then the question is sort of, what do they look like and how do they move? So for example, you might see something that looks like a planet, for example, or what I call the comet. So the comet is where you start to see this like a sphere, and then you might see a wind going past it. You can actually literally see the wind blowing as the pixels coalesce more and more into dedicated colors and images, three-dimensionality around the sphere. And you can see this part is doing what air does, and this part is doing what earth element does, right? And the earth elements are still, generally. They might move in very sort of defined, they might rotate or they might, do something, but they're relatively fixed structures, whereas the winds will start to do things that are very wind-like, and then watery things will start to flow, right? And you can see them flowing like a stream or flowing over what appears to be like a dam or a something, and they'll be flowing along in a straight line in a way that is clearly a watery sort of a way to move and do things. And then you'll start to see flares, which are like these sort of, like an amber, for me it's usually amber, can be other colors too, like these flares that'll sort of wash across, almost like if you've got a leaf and you've ever lit it on fire and it's a dry leaf and you can see the flares kind of moving across. So you'll start to get these kinds of things. And so you can then actually tune to a specific one of those that you prefer, and these things are interactive. So as you start to say, oh, I really like the way the watery things go, as you reward, say, oh, thanks, water, you'll start to get more watery things or air things. And this has become something of a negotiation, which is one of the other curious things about fire kasina. It's like you're in a conversation with the thing. You almost never get total control of it, sometimes for brief periods, but usually it's like you're in this interactivity with something that in theory is your own brain or whatever from a meat brain point of view, which is only one way to look at this. And then, so those are the intermediaries, but you look at things and it's actually the stillness of earth things that is the most striking. They don't generally make sound unless they're falling. They are still, they are quiet, they are silent, they are just there. And so actually I ended up doing a bunch of meditation at a beach because I thought this is a perfect place. You got the sun for fire, you got the big sky, you've got the water, you've got the sand for earth. And so actually one of my favorite places to do this is right at the beach, looking at the water, there's the sun and everything. But the earth element of the wind is blowing, so you get the wind and everything, but the sand is generally still, unless the wind blows it, and then you can hear the sand doing whatever it does. Anyway, did that sort of semi-get at the question?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll give you another, and we're going to bring this to an end and open up for questions in a few minutes. Because we're very boorish people in that way, we could just keep talking and talking and talking.
That is true.
Not to speak for yourself.
Well, actually, I am that way, I admit it freely. Sorry, anyway.
But another project we have at UVA, which I've not been involved with up until now, but I'm not trying not to be involved with, is a product of the Environmental Science Department and the Music Department and Religious Studies, and it's called the Conservatory. And this goes back to your issue about, is Earth really quiet? It seems to be quiet.
Until it moves.
But, or maybe even, maybe that quiet is our perspective. And so the Chesapeake Bay is nearby UVA, and we have a long-standing relationship with the Chesapeake Bay through the National Science Foundation funding, and UVA scientists are constantly there doing these decades-long projects there. And so the project involved a composer from our music department, Matthew Bertner, taking equipment and to the Bay Area, and he inserted these high-fidelity microphones into oysters in the Bay, and then he used these really high-end headphones for the scientist, so he was basically in real time putting the scientist into the sonic environment of oysters. Now, you look at oysters and you think, those are quiet little dudes. I mean, they don't move, they just sit there and so forth. It turns out they are very noisy. So when you take their interior and you render it in this, how sound is so immersive, when you're really immersed in it, it has a very striking experience. It was a phenomenal experience to impact these scientists who'd spent years studying these oysters, and suddenly they were transferred into the sonic experience of those oysters. And it was revelatory for them.
Nice.
So our idea is to take that, and in the Contemplative Commons, we're trying to create an immersive sound studio where we have speakers distributed throughout the walls and the ceilings so that we can choreograph these kinds of immersive experiences, whether of data sets or nature or musical compositions and so forth. And that goes back to what I said about the way that artist thought of the sound of earth as the sound of those trees, which also look very
right.
still and majestic.
But they
And
make
it
a lot of
turns out
sound.
they make a lot of sound.
Yeah.
Like water's rushing up, they're responding to insect invasions, and so forth.
They creak
Yeah.
and they groan and they also, and
Exactly.
you can hear bamboo growing actually.
Yeah. So then I just thought, I wonder, like, I've been thinking about this. Is Earth really quiet, or is the way to meditate upon Earth to go beyond that apparent quietness and hear
I like it.
another layer of sounds?
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, both sound delightful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, solid things, you can hear a solid thing is going to, making a sound is going to sound different from a windy thing or a watery thing making a sound. Like, obviously, the click of the microphone when you just hit that switch, it was clearly an earthy thing making that sound. Water wouldn't have made that, air wouldn't have made that, fire wouldn't have made that. That's an earth click, right? Of course, you can identify the elemental quality of the origin of the sound.
Right. Like that clay,
Right, yeah, that's why I said I like that one. Yeah, when you said that's cool.
Yeah. Well, maybe at this point, it just gives you a taste of what kind of stuff is involved in these practices and traditions, and so we can just open it up for any kinds of questions people might have or comments.
Sort of fun. We're using the mic.
Actually picks up, they said, in the room, but in that case.
Oh, what's that?
It says that the.
Oh, the room should pick it up. Okay, great. Yeah, cool. Well, I'll sit up here anyway since I'm here. So one thing on the sound of Earth, it just reminded me. There was a study, I don't know, years ago, and I don't remember the details of the study, but I can find them out, where they found that the Earth has a certain frequency to it, right? Like a very low hertz. You can't hear it with like a normal ear, but we are affected by it on a bodily level. And they found what the hertz was of that, and they put people in a room, and they, like kind of like a bunker, and they fed like, I can't remember what the science of it behind it is, but it's like a way to drown out that frequency level, right? And so that they were no longer experiencing the sound of Earth, and that people were just really thrown off kilter by that. Over the course of a couple weeks, they were just kind of really thrown off. And so we can talk about like the actual, I can find out what the actual study was of that. But that's just to kind of respond to the sound of Earth and what is that and how we're affected by it. And kind of on that a little bit, you've been talking a lot about the fire kasina and the kasina practice in general, really in kind of visual terms, right? You're looking at the flame, you're seeing these kinds of things, that's really what you're focusing on. And we've touched a little bit on sound and other things, but I just want to hear more about like the other sensory ways that you're both practicing with the elements and that you're experiencing emergent phenomena, and like how important those are, which ones are more important than others, if some are more important for certain elements, both in the kinds of the input and the output of it.
Actually, that could be a huge, long thing. And
Yeah,
I'm
for
just
sure.
gonna start with one very simple thing, which is easy to wrap your head around and straightforward and practical. So it's day probably 18 or something of the 1 month kasina we did. I've been doing mostly fire kasina, and this is at Denman Island off Vancouver, Canada. And it would have been early November by this point, so it's pretty cool. It's getting into the low 30s there at night. It does have that Sunshine Coast thing where it doesn't get as cold as you would expect for its northern latitude, but yeah, it still gets pretty cold. And I was the first into the meditation yurt, which has no insulation essentially, after dinner, and someone had let the fire go out, and it's now ambient temperature, which by that point at night is probably 38 degrees, and so it's pretty cold in there. And so I lit the fire and I went to sit down, but the fire hadn't reached where my cushion was, which was about 20 feet away or anything close. I'm sitting there in 38-degree cold, and I all of a sudden say, hey, fire element, would you be so kind as to warm me up a little bit? So 2 seconds later, I suddenly start pouring sweat, and I suddenly feel like I have a fever, and I totally overshot. I just I don't know, I'm still learning control of these things. I'm no master of these practices, but I've had a lot of fun exploring them. But all of a sudden, I'm just totally burning up. I'm taking off my jacket as fast as I can and going, wait a second, okay, yeah, calm down, back down. But I did, suddenly, the 38-degree room I was in, this is one of these practical things, right? David talks about, needing heat in these cold places, and it turns out you can do that with these sorts of practices. And then there's all kinds of, that's like the sort of I'll call the light tip of the non-weird iceberg, right? Or I guess Fireberg or something. Anyway, it's the wrong element here. But then you can do much weirder things, like energetic stuff that other people can feel, or wow, where to even begin? And then there's a stage way out past it called malleable and wieldy, where like if you get your concentration strong enough, you can kind of do anything, which sounds absurd, but you can make your experience pretty much any way you want it to be. See, hear, feel, taste, touch, anything. That's a strange space to be in. I've only been up that high 3 times, and not for terribly long. But when you're there, like the whole thing, all of this seemingly now constructed reality becomes up for grabs in terms of your own experience. What anybody else would think of your experience is probably complicated. Another strange thing in terms of, well, that's another visual one, never mind. But anyway, so that's another huge topic I could go on and on about. Do you want to chime in on this some here, like experiences or answers? Or
I talk to him all the time.
Okay, cool, never mind. All right, good.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just as one little obvious, useful thing.
And that's, you notice that more in the experiencing of them rather than the practicing of it. Like, is the practice still really this visual base of I'm looking at the fire and I want to draw up, like this kind of conversation you're saying you're having, I want to draw up more of a, let's say, tactile, like a bodily response, feeling heat. But is the input of that, the practice that you're doing, still a visually sensory oriented one, or does
it starts visual? So the ones I do tend to start visual, and that's just the tradition I'm coming from, where the kasinas all start visual.
Yeah, they're visual. Okay.
But then what they end up is anything. Like, I don't know where they couldn't go. They do weird somatic things, they do energetic things, they do temperature things, they do mood things, they do perceptual things in any sense door. So I've had times where suddenly I could smell incense. I've had weird taste effects that have occurred. I've heard things, sounds, voices, all kinds of stuff. I've been able to feel things. So one of the weirder ones in terms of a tactile thing is one of the things I like to play around a lot with is the limited space kasina. And so the limited space kasina is basically you take some things that bound space and you stare at the space itself, which is sort of a weird thing to do because your eye wants to, pick some other target. But if you stare right here at this space, all of a sudden it'll start to do stuff. And it'll get colorful, and it'll get splines, and it'll get, whatever color you've been working with generally. But then others start weird stuff. Like, usually if I stare at the space between my hands, I get a purple ball, which eventually becomes sort of a whitish goldeny ball. And then it starts to get these lines coming out from it, like these splines or, spikes or spines or whatever. And then they tend to start to rotate in sort of various vortexy kind of ways. And then if that gets strong enough, I can actually feel these things moving through my hands, and it starts to get synesthetic, where it starts to impact other things. I've never gotten to the point where I could hear it, but I've heard all kinds of other stuff. So anyway, but these things start to, the sense door barriers start breaking down, and it goes to farther and farther and more complete places. Yeah. Thoughts? No. I keep wanting to hear more of your stuff on this. Like, we haven't talked as much practice stuff.
I'm always here in Charlottesville. So.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Just to kind of follow up on this, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on sensory deprivation and these practices. They are so found in sensory experience, but would there be any benefit of doing this test through visualization, not just with the mind, in a sensory deprivation tank?
Well, I have one in my house. So I was given a very unusual gift by a curious philanthropist who didn't need it anymore. They're like, "Hey, you want my float tank?" I'm like, "Yeah." Anyway, so I have a pro-grade float tank in my house, and actually back in March got to do lead a psychology student, a PhD student actually, research psychology, who came and did 3 weeks of fire kasina, and she totally took to the tank. And she started doing up to 6 hours at a float, where she would be in the tank for 6 hours, and she floated almost every day once she discovered it and realized she really liked it. And So I got to see a lot of that. And I've floated a bunch. It's my tank as well. And on this retreat I just did, so I just did a 3-week fire kasina retreat that ended, it's right towards the end of August, I guess the 27th-ish, 28th. And I would float about 2 hours most days. And the funny thing about a sensory deprivation tank is it's kind of a misnomer, right? Because sometimes it's a sensory intensification tank. Sometimes it's a sensory, I don't know what in the world that was, but it's doing something really strange tank. Sometimes I have all kinds of weird kinetic effects and strange feeling like waves of energy are going through my body. Sometimes there's lots of visuals. I see a lot of purple because that's my color. This is what I see when I close my eyes, a lot of things. I've occasionally heard stuff in there when you have earplugs in and it's super sound isolated. So I think float tanks are really cool and a really neat thing to play around with when playing around with these kinds of technologies. So I'm a fan. We also, I must say, we tend to keep the rooms pretty dark when we practice. We actually tend to practice in reclining chairs. So like lazy boys, like as cushy as you could possibly get, like rather than the rigid postures where your knees hurt and your back hurts. Actually, I've done plenty of that and plenty of kasina doing that. But I've also realized that there's also definitely a place for getting the body out of the way and having what ends up, since it's a quiet room and you're in a super cushy chair and it's dark and your eyes are closed. And often then we'll sometimes like to get really into the internal rather than the external, put a hood over or a mask or something and get really into it. So we end up playing a lot around with variants of sensory deprivation, which ends up often being, again, sensory intensification or alteration rather than really deprivation. How about you? Have you played around with these things, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I have just one experience in the tank.
Yeah.
Very sensory intensive too.
You want to? Sorry, I always like other people telling their experiences. You want to talk about it?
Well, it wasn't like any kind of interesting, wonderful visions or anything. Just a lot of colors and a lot of sensations, and at the same time very, very relaxing. Kind of feeling like deeply relaxed.
Nice. Yeah.
No smells really or tastes or anything. Just kind of bodily feelings and.
Well, on that context, in Tibetan Buddhism, the primary way that happens is darkness.
Yeah.
And so I have, with a friend of mine at Stanford the last few years, been working on this project on darkness meditation, where you spend sustained periods of time, meaning days and even weeks, in complete pitch black darkness. And I think the whole idea of sensory deprivation is simply that you're removing external sensory input, not that you're removing sensory experience. Because what happens is endogenously generated sensory experience comes to the fore. And if you're sitting in the darkness for a while, you probably won't be surprised that you start to see a lot of things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, if time allows, I have 2 questions, actually. The first one is, when you were having this dialogue about the sounds of Earth, in my mind, I was also thinking about Earth's creatures. I don't know if you would categorize them necessarily as anything else. For example, sounds that creatures make, I feel like that wouldn't necessarily be fire or water or wind. It might belong to Earth, and it's still such a part of nature that I feel like it might belong in that realm. So I was wondering your thoughts on that, because I was also wondering, we as creatures that originate in nature, have you ever tried, or what are your thoughts on using our bodies as visual sort of objects when it comes to kasina? Like using your body visually as that object instead of like a candle or a flame or a sound.
Yeah, I've got a lot of different thoughts on that. The first is, at least from a sort of a Buddhist technical analysis, we would contain all the elements. So, obviously we're a lot of water, and we've got fire, and we've got winds, and balances of winds is a big part of how we classify a lot of these experiences. And then, obviously we've got earthy components and stuff, and so I think, but yes, a lot of earth-ish kind of quality to us, obviously. But the other thing is, I don't necessarily have to fit everything into every system. and then meditating on the natural world, on animals, on the sounds, on birds. Like on this recent retreat, I actually found myself outside in our screened-in hammock lounge listening to birds and just listening to the sounds of the forest. And then there would be the coyotes occasionally, and then there would be there's the vultures, and there's the hawks, and there's the little birds, and there's the woodpecker. I can hear it, and then and so that is just a whole different interesting thing. And taking nature as object is really its own whole, that's a whole talk or a whole tradition almost, right? And so that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is actually there's a whole lot of different meditations where you take your body as a visual and or more complicated and elaborate object. That's actually such a huge topic that both of us could probably talk till the proverbial cows came home and not have even scratched the surface of it. I will just say, actually, from my ceremonial magic / Kabbalistic thing, they actually do something called building the body of light, which they then, where you visualize all of yourself as a light being, and then you can do stuff with that light being. I've also had actually, while doing kasina practices and elemental practices, all of a sudden my chakra channels showed up, and so I could see all of my nadis and whatever, kind of like they showed in the old books. It didn't look quite the same, and it was all in red, white, and blue. I don't know if that was patriotic or just, something. But blockages were generally in red, and then there was blue, and then the white channels, and anyway. So that was just the way it showed up for me that day, and all of a sudden my whole body became this sort of illuminated thing, and that would just happen to be from regular, that was actually my first fire kasina retreat where I was doing it, the first one I described. That showed up. Where were we? You had a bunch of other questions. Did I miss one of your questions, or was that all of them?
No, that was it. I just had a second one if other people don't have.
Well, I'll just jump in on the first
Please.
question first.
I'd love to hear.
So two things. One is, when you look at the accounts of these practices on meditating on the sound of water and the sound of fire and so forth, one of the things that I think really strikes you is that they focus on hearing voices of other creatures in this world. And so after 7 days, 8 days, 9 days, what you begin to hear is the sound of various agents in this cosmology. They might be spiritual agents, like different kinds of demons or human or non-human animals and so forth. But that's a really striking feature, that actually in those sounds of water or fire, they begin to take the shape of articulate voices of animate life, so which goes so the outcome instead of the input in a sense. And then the second thing, of course, that's the oysters is exactly about that subject, right? Like use the oysters as your topic of meditation.
Nice.
And for this room that we're trying to build in the Contemplative Commons that we call the Conservatory after that environmental science project, that's partly what we're trying to accomplish then, is to bring in those more than human voices in this world and see what happens when you bring sustained attention to those voices in a collective fashion where the sound is just all embracing, and begin to unpack that. We can look at data sets and just here's a New York Times article and it cites this and that and so forth, and that'll be compelling to some people some of the times and so forth. But another way to open people's mind to conversations and discussions is for this sensorial experience of data or sensorial experience of other forms of life and so forth that then possibly makes forward other kinds of conversations. And finally, like Daniel was saying, in Tibetan Buddhism, the dominant traditions of meditation are about the body. These things we're talking about are so marginal.
Yeah.
And so the dominant ones are two big typologies that have lots of subcategories. The first one is you visualize your body as the body of a Buddha, and with the colors and the shapes, the number of hands, the implements, etc. And that's called deity yoga, transforming your identity by revisualizing your body. And first you dissolve your current body into emptiness, and then it gets regenerated as light. The light becomes a syllable, the syllable becomes a Buddha, etc. And the second main class of Buddhist traditions of meditation in Tibet are focused on the interior of the body, where you visualize the interior of your body, and that can be also fire. You can visualize a fire in your body and have it flame up, and all sorts of practices like that.
Or dakinis pouring it into your head, like the thing.
Or light coming into the head, or different kinds of forces. And those can actually be elemental, because one of the things that supposedly happens is when you do these deep meditations, then these different forms of the elements in your body, like fire and earth and so forth, begin to dissolve, and you have visual experiences that map the dissolution of those elemental forces in your body. So it's a big, big thing, yeah. So second question.
I'll defer if someone else has a question first.
Okay, so I have small question. This you mentioned like kasina meditation, right? So in Tibet Buddhism, they are like, for example, like skeleton meditation, like all the like if you meditate, and then you can see all the slowly you can see all the surround your place will become like kingri. So, but
What's the word he's using?
Skeleton.
A skeleton, yes, thank you. Thank you.
So, my question is, like, for example, in Tibet Buddhism, we say skeleton meditation, this consciousness, wrong consciousness, which is lokshe. Right? If you focus on the fire like this, not really wrong consciousness, because fires there exist. So, for example, if you meditate on the emptiness, and then it's really different, right? So, do you have any thoughts on that? For example, like you meditate on skeleton, right?
Skeleton.
For example, you meditate on fire. So any like you think you see as differentiation.
I'm not sure I entirely understand that question. Do you want to start?
Well, I think it's, classic skeleton meditation, which is not Tibetan in particular.
Well, actually, we've done a lot of, so in the 40 objects of meditation in Theravada Buddhism, a whole bunch of them are also related to various forms of a corpse, right? A fresh corpse, a bloating corpse, a rotting corpse, skeleton. It would be the farthest, anyway. So there are all of these. Weirdly enough, my 160 hours of dissecting a corpse down to nothing was actually, in some ways, I actually took it as that practice when I was doing it, because I got 160 hours of meditating on a corpse, literally, which most people wouldn't have done. So I actually found that quite profound. In terms of seeing things, weirdly enough, kasina practices, it is not that uncommon to see skulls. That's actually not that strange a thing to see. Talking skulls, crystal skulls, metal skulls. I've seen a number of skulls, which are, obviously part of a skeleton. You were talking about the skillfulness versus non-skillfulness of meditating on emptiness versus meditating on those. One of the curious things, Oh,
Sorry.
totally understand. Bye. So one of the curious things, where to go with this, is how to operationalize emptiness. So how do you conceive of emptiness from a meditative point of view? And this is actually one of the more fascinating kasina topics that I get into a lot, actually. So is emptiness, it's empty of a self because it arises naturally, dependent on causes, not a separate doer or agent, correct? So the fact that a skull might just show up on its own is actually emptiness, because you didn't create that skull. All of a sudden you're seeing a skull. The skull itself knows itself where it is. It itself is luminous intrinsically to itself. And so it is empty of an observer. It's actually just the skull. So the other thing is, even if you were seeing a skull or a skeleton, and the skull itself is ephemeral, it will change, it will disappear, it will alter. So it's empty of a stable self as well. And so the way you conceptualize and operationalize emptiness, as I was saying, one of the weird things about these practices is you think you're doing a shamatha practice or shamatha, but you actually can end up getting insight because you see the true nature of these things as they arise, because the mind gets very, very clear. And you can see they are luminous where they are transient, they are causal, they are natural, they are part of this unfolding thing. Anyway, you can see these different aspects of emptiness, even in these seemingly formed specifics. I don't know if that's helpful or answered your question. This is obviously one of the most important topics of the whole thing. What have you got?
I don't know that I have anything particularly. I think we should probably bring it to a close here.
Okay, cool.
But if anybody wants to come up and ask other questions of Daniel, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them. So thanks everybody for coming here on Friday and on short notice, and thanks Daniel for coming here and sharing your experience and reflections with us.
Thank you so much. This has been tremendous fun. And I hope you all, if you're interested in practicing these things, I hope you do it well and skillfully. And hopefully have some friends around. Even though I consider myself good at these things and have done them a bunch of times where I had to go on a solo fire casino retreat, I would make sure I had friends I could call. Anyway.
Thanks.
Yeah.